30 years ago, a remote moose hunting trip for Gunter and two of his friends turned into a nightmare that they'll never forget. Before we get into their story, welcome back to Dark Wilderness, where I share encounters with the unexplained. If you have a story you would like to share, please email it to me at the link below. And if you like today's story, please gently slap that like button, as I'll be uploading 3 to 5 times every week. So don't forget to load that subscribe button into your canoe so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. Back in the early 90s, Gunter and two of his friends had gone for a 2-week-long moose hunting trip up in northern Ontario. Now, these 3 guys were not your normal weekend warrior hunter types either. These guys had been hunting big game all over North America, and they had actually gone on a couple of safaris down in Africa as well for big game. So they were no strangers to the type of hunt that they were getting themselves into on this trip. Now, this area where they were going, they had been to it a couple times before, but it had been a few years since they had been out there. So Gunter said their plan was to get this float plane to fly them to the lake, drop them off for 2 weeks, come back, pick them up, and bring them home with whatever moose they got. So on the first day, when the plane landed, it went across a lake, and it went over to the area where they normally set their camp up. Everybody got off the plane, they grabbed all their equipment, all their gear, grabbed their canoe, and then they waved goodbye to the pilot. The pilot took off, and now they were alone for 2 weeks. Gunter said the first few days they were just kind of trying to get reacquainted with the lay of the land, just because it had been probably about 3 or 4 years since they had been out there. So they just wanted to refamiliarize themselves with everything. Gunter said the first week they didn't see any moose that they were able to shoot, so they were feeling a little bit bummed, and it was about day 8 they decided they were going to try on the other side of this lake. On the other side of this lake, Gunter says, a spot that he typically normally liked to hunt, but they hadn't gone over to that side yet on this trip because they were seeing a lot of sign on the side of the lake by their camp. Now, after a week of not seeing anything on that side, they decided to broaden their horizons, so all 3 guys decided they were going to go hunt Gunter's spot on the other side of the lake. Now, Gunter said on the other side of the lake, he said that there's a bit of a hill that goes up, and then it gets to about a 10-foot vertical cliff. So Gunter said you got to go up this hill, then you got to scale this cliff, and you get on to the top, and there's this ridge. And he said this ridge looks down into a valley. And in this valley, he said it's just a big marshy swamp on the one side, and on the other side, it's just really dense woods. So Gunter and his buddy Mike decided they were going to post right up at the top of this ridge, and their other buddy Bob was going to go over and then down and hunt over along the side of this slough. So Gunter and Mike were up on the top of the ridge, and they were looking down into this valley, and all of a sudden Gunter spotted a big bull moose coming out of that thick woods towards that slough. So Gunter got his rifle up, got the moose in his sights, squeezed the trigger, and Gunter said this moose didn't make it 20 yards, and it went down hard right at the edge of that real thick woods. So Gunter and Mike high-fived each other. They called their buddy, they yelled for him super loud, called for Bob to come because they're going to need help field dressing this thing. So they waited on top of the ridge. Bob came up. The 3 men ended up heading down the other side of the ridge towards the woods to go deal with this moose. So the 3 men, they ended up field dressing the moose. They started to quarter it out. Now, the problem was their canoe, even though it was big enough for all 3 of them, it wasn't big enough for 3 of them plus a bunch of moose meat. So one of them was going to have to stay behind. So Gunter said, well, I shot it, I'll stay behind. You two, you guys can take the meat back to camp, come back, and while you guys are gone, I'm going to start lugging what I can back down to the shore. So they grabbed the meat that they'd already taken off the moose, they brought it down to the canoe, loaded it up. Bob and Mike headed across the lake in their canoe, and Gunter was all by himself on the far shore. So Gunter stood there for a few minutes. Gunter said he ended up having a smoke, finished the smoke, put it out, and he said he was going to go back up now to the moose. He was going to start trying to process a little bit more of it. So Gunter said he goes back up that hill, up that cliff to the top of the ridge, and back down over towards the woods. Gunter said when he got to where they had been processing the moose was gone. He said the The gut pile was there, and you could tell that they had been processing the moose there, but the moose itself was just gone. So Gunter started looking around because he figured, okay, maybe it was a bear. He figured that's the only animal big enough that might be able to pull this moose. And because if it would have been a pack of wolves, there'd be pieces of it everywhere, but there was nothing. So Gunter's looking around, but he said he didn't see any drag marks, nothing to indicate that a bear had come and grabbed the carcass and started dragging it deeper into the woods. So Gunter said he kind of kept his rifle handy, and he said he started to walk in like a semicircle around from where he was standing into the bush around, and then he went a few yards further and then made an even wider circle after that, figuring that if maybe a bear did grab the moose, it wouldn't have went very far, because typically when a bear will grab a carcass, they won't drag it too far. They'll drag it just inside the trees, and they'll bury it with leaves and sticks, basically just to keep it out of the sight of other predators, out of sight of the birds. But he said he couldn't find this thing anywhere. So he decided he was just going to head back to the lake and wait for his buddies to come back, and then the three of them could go look for this thing together. So that's exactly what he did. He went up that ridge, down, waited at the shoreline. About an hour and a half later, Mike and Bob came back. So he told them, hey guys, like, this moose is gone. And they're like, how could it be gone? You must have went to the wrong spot. Have you been drinking? Like, you went to the wrong spot. Gunter said, no, like, I was at the right spot. Like, I could see where we processed it, and it's just gone. His two buddies, though, they did not believe him. So all three of the guys went up that hill, up the cliff to the top of the ridge. They went down, went into the woods, went to where they had been processing this moose, and sure enough, the moose was just gone. So Gunter's buddies had no idea what to make of this. Like, they could have not wrapped their heads around how this moose carcass is just gone. Because they're just like Gunter, there was no drag marks, no nothing. So the three men actually ended up fanning out, and they started going deeper into the woods, trying to find any signs of what happened to this moose. And Gunter said about 20 minutes later, all of a sudden he hears his buddy Bob, which was probably about 100 yards away, start screaming for them. And it wasn't just like, hey guys, I found it. No, it was like a full-on scream, like something had horrified him. So Gunter and Mike went sprinting off towards where Bob was calling them from. And when they got to where Bob was just pointing up. He wasn't speaking or nothing. He was just pointing up into this tree. So Gunter and Mike look up in this tree, and about 12 feet up, right in this tree crotch, is Gunter's moose. So the three men are looking at this thing, wondering what dragged like 1,300 pounds of moose 12 feet up into a tree. Now, as I had said, all three of these guys have hunted big game all over North America, and they even hunted in Africa. So they're very familiar with big cats, especially from in Africa. So they know big cats can drag a carcass up a tree, but that'll typically be a smaller animal, like a deer, or in Africa, like a gazelle or something, but not a 1,300-pound moose. So they're looking up at this moose, and they're just all speechless. They don't know what put this moose up in this tree. So they start to feel pretty uneasy, because they're wondering now, is there like some type of giant mutant cat that just pulled this moose up this tree, or like what's going on? So they decided they were just going to back out of there, and they were going to come back in the morning and try to figure out exactly what happened. So they actually hightailed it pretty quick back to their canoe. They got in the canoe and they went back across the lake to camp. They were talking at camp about what this could have been, like what could have pulled this moose up this tree, and not one of the three men had any reasonable answer as to what had done this. So that night they all went to bed, and Gunter said it was around 2 o'clock in the morning. All of a sudden they could just hear like super loud snapping, just loud snapping of branches and like big thick tree limbs just breaking. Said it sounded like a windstorm, like how loud the cracking was. So Gunter said he got out of the tent. He had a flashlight. He's looking around trying to figure out what's going on, figuring maybe there was a bear rummaging around camp, and it just sounded loud because it was so close. But he said he didn't see anything. So he went back in the tent, and he said a few hours later, all of a sudden they could hear something just beating up their canoe. They could just hear the sound of the metal being thumped up against and just loud banging. So the three men thought maybe just by chance, maybe there was another group of hunters or somebody was vandalizing their canoe. So the three men ran out of the tent with their rifles and they went running towards the shoreline. And when they got to the shoreline, Gunter said this canoe was just completely mangled. He said it was just more or less almost folded in on itself, and there was no way this thing was going to float anymore. He said it was just absolutely destroyed. So the three men were now freaking out because they're trying to figure out what pulled this moose up a tree and what now just made a soup can out of our canoe. So they decided they were going to go back to the tent and they were not going to sleep for the rest of the night. There was only about an hour of nighttime left before the sun would come up anyway, but they decided they were just not going to sleep. So come dawn, they went to go check out the damage to the canoe in daylight to see if, maybe their minds played tricks on them. Maybe they were just nervous. Maybe the damage to the canoe is not that bad. When they got down to where the canoe was, they realized that no, this damage is bad. This thing was literally like folded in on itself. So now they're kind of freaking out because they know that they're still out here for a week and they don't know who or what just destroyed their canoe and who or what dragged this moose up a tree. So they decided they were not going to go hunting that day. They were just going to stay at camp because now all three men were just too nervous to leave the camp. Gunter said every night for the remainder of that trip, their camp was harassed. He said the one night something actually came up to the tent and actually ripped a big rip right down the side of their big prospector tent. So the entire time that they were there for the rest of this trip, that they were just always on edge. They were having rocks thrown at their camp. Stuff in their camp was getting destroyed. Gunter even said that this one night they could hear screams, like real loud screaming. He said it would come from one side of the camp, there would be a loud scream, followed by a couple seconds later a loud scream on the other side of camp. Gunter said on the last day, the last night before the plane was coming to pick them up, he said that night was the absolute worst. He said all night it was just nonstop screaming of whatever or whoever this was in the bush. Just kept screaming all around camp. He said it sounded like there must have been about 6 people or 6 of these things. He knows that they weren't people. I'll get into that in a minute, but he said it was just sounded like there were 6 of them just screaming all night. And at one point it sounded like something was coming through the trees right towards their tent. So all 3 men, he said they jumped up and they just ran out the front door. He said they just ran out. They ran down towards the water. He said when they got to the shore, they all got their guns up and they were aiming back towards their tent because they don't know what this was that was running towards them. So they all had their guns up, and Gunter said all of a sudden this big boulder, he said this thing was like 2 times the size of his head, came flying in between him and Mike and crashed into the water behind them. So he said when that boulder came whipping past him, he turned to look and I looked back towards camp, and he said when he looked back towards camp in the faint glow of the fire that they had left smoldering all night to try to ward off whatever these things were that were screaming, he said in the glow of the fire he saw this creature that he described as being about 9 feet tall, completely covered in dark hair, and he said it had red eyes. He said these eyes were just staring right at him. He said he had his rifle aimed right at its chest. He said he doesn't know why he didn't shoot. He just felt like if he shot, that him and his 2 buddies were not going to be leaving there. He felt like if he shot this creature in front of him, those other creatures that were screaming at them all night would get him and his friends. So he said he actually just ended up lowering his rifle because he figured there's nothing I could do. Like if I shoot this thing, I'm dead anyway. So he said he just lowered his rifle. And he said as soon as he lowered his rifle, this creature turned and just ran off into the dark woods. Now, Gunter said that remainder of that night, they did not leave the shoreline. They just stood with their backs to the water staring towards camp. He said in the morning, it was around 10 o'clock, he said they could hear the plane coming. And he said it was just the biggest relief of his life and his friends' lives to hear this plane coming in the distance. Now, when the plane landed, the pilot asked, like, what happened? Like, your canoe's completely destroyed. What happened there? Now, Gunter said that he didn't want to tell the pilot exactly what happened because he didn't want the pilot to think that they were crazy. Gunter said he felt crazy after all this, but he says that this story 100% happened to him and his friends, and he said that his two friends will not talk about it even to this day. This was almost 30 years ago already. Now, Gunter said that if you ever come across one of these things, he said, and you're armed, not to try shooting him. He said, just lower your rifle, talk calmly, say, I don't want to hurt you, please don't hurt me. And he said just to turn around and walk back on the same path that you walked in on. Now, I was talking with Gunter about this, and because I've heard stories like this before about animals being dragged up into trees. And Gunter said that he's done some research on that as well, especially after what he saw. And he figures that that was a warning for them to get out of there. And he said that if these things really wanted to get him and his friends, that they would have got them. He just figures that they were very territorial. And he says that basically, if you're out in the woods, it doesn't matter if you're by yourself, 1, 2, 3, 4 people. He said just always be alert. Always just kind of pay attention to the subtleties. If you hear the woods all of a sudden go quiet, just to know that, that means there's a predator in the area, and you don't always know exactly what that predator is going to be. And he said that there are things out there that we don't really learn about in school or you don't really see about on TV. He says, so just to keep a very open mind and just be extra alert whenever you're in the woods. Well, that's it for today's encounter. Thanks for joining us. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you next time.